Guys, welcome to the Global Insights channel. And today I'm very glad to host Professor Tim Bale from Queen Mary University of London. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
And we would like to discuss the exciting, fascinating British political scene and, of course, the new contender to the Prime Minister office, the head of the opposition, Kemi Badenoch. I don't know. First, simple question: whether do you think it's a good bet for the Conservative Party, and if she will be able to win the office?
Well, she is known as the high risk, high return candidate, by which I mean she is someone who is very forthright, sometimes quite abrasive, but also seen as pretty bright and therefore able, I think, to cut through to voters. So she isn't going to be someone who can be easily ignored. And that, I think, is a strength when someone is the leader of the opposition. On the other hand, she does occasionally, partly because of her personality, I think, run the risk of saying and doing things that she later reflects on as mistakes and are seen by others as mistakes. I think you would also have to say, stepping back a little bit more away from her personality, that I'm afraid she doesn't really represent that much of a change in terms of the Conservative Party's direction, in the sense that she is very much a Thatcherite, by which I mean she is someone who believes very strongly in a much smaller state, lower taxes, lower spending. And that's something I think that isn't particularly popular with the public right now anyway. And she is also, perhaps more than many other Conservatives, seen as something of a culture warrior, in the sense that she is very hot on the idea that the establishment, as it were, and indeed, Britain as a whole, has been rather captured by what she refers to as woke, particularly when it comes to, for example, the question of transgender. Now, that obviously is an important issue for some voters, but it's only a very small minority who really care about that issue compared with, say, the economy or the state of public services. So I wouldn't write off her chances at all, but I'm not sure that some of the optimism that surrounds her election to the leadership is justified.
I was just hearing you on few occasions talking, for example, about Middle East and Israel, and she's saying very simple things, but currently in this turbulent world, this, simple things, the bad, the evil, the good and evil, very simple, basic things, they like something like very refreshing voice suddenly. Yeah, maybe like 20 years ago, 30 years ago, it would not be interesting, but today it's really interesting. So do you
Yeah.
think she's just not afraid to tell what she thinks? Because it looks like she's just telling the simple things which she believes in without any hesitation.
Yes, I mean, she is a straight shooter in that sense. She certainly, I think, has the courage of her own convictions, and those convictions are very strong. Some would say that the flip side of that is some of the thinking is rather, as you've already suggested, black and white, to some people anyway, quite simplistic. But of course, it's also true to say that it's much easier to make very strong, simple statements when you're the leader of the opposition rather than when you are the prime minister of the country. When obviously there's an extent to which nuance matters. You have to maintain relations with other countries and other communities and other interest groups. So while I think it may be an advantage for her as an opposition leader, I think perhaps as a prime minister, were she ever to become prime minister, it might not be such a useful quality. But let's see. I mean, she is going to be leader of the opposition for 4 or 5 years, at least if she maintains that position. So she has quite a long time in order to perhaps nuance some of those opinions to perhaps pull back from some of the more simplistic statements. But as I say, that assumes that she will be the leader of the opposition who leads the Conservative Party into the next election, which will be in 28, 29. Very often, especially with the Conservative Party, we found that unless the leader seems to have taken the party into a lead over the government, then that leader doesn't last so long. So she's probably only got 2 years in which to kind of prove herself and to prove that she can get voters on side.
So you are not so optimistic about the Labour government, if I understand you right. If you say like 2 years.
Well, no, I mean, I think the Labour government is likely to last 4 or 5 years. It's the question is Kemi Badenoch likely to last more than 2 years? The Conservative Party has been portrayed as an autocracy tempered by assassination, by which we mean that the leader is very dominant in the party until it looks as if they're not going to provide the goods electorally. And if that happens, the party is actually very good at getting rid of leaders very quickly and replacing them with someone else. But you're right to point to the fact that the Labour Party in government has had a very rocky start. It has put through some fairly unpopular tax rises, including taxes on business in particular, and taxes on the farming community, which aren't going down very well, at least with supporters of the Conservative Party. But I should stress that in some ways the Conservative Party has to be very careful that it doesn't associate itself with minority interest groups with whom the public may not have as much sympathy as they assume. And I'm not sure wealthy farmers, for example, I'm not sure that people who are in the 6% of parents who send their children to private schools are necessarily the people that the Conservative Party wants to get on side. It has to think about the 94% of parents, for example, who don't send their children to private schools, who send them to state schools. And it has to think of the 99% of people who aren't employed in agriculture.
Lately, Labours, they're very engaged in very anti-Israel rhetoric. But maybe that's a less problem for them. But they also were engaged in anti-Trump. And then even I would say they insulted Trump. So would it affect the relations, you think, between the United Kingdom and the US? And of course, the chances of the new Labour government to survive in this environment when, unfortunately for them, Trump won the election.
Yes, I mean, I don't think there's any doubt that most Labour people would have preferred Harris to win. It would have been, in some senses, business as usual had that been the case. And you're also right to say that there are many MPs, including the Foreign Secretary of the country, David Lammy, who have said very, let's face it, disobliging things, and that's putting it politely, about Donald Trump in the past. Having said that, of course, it is true that many people now working for President Trump and President-elect Trump, I should say, have said, disobliging things about him, including, for example, his vice president. So those Labour MPs who've done that aren't unique in the world and aren't even unique in the potential Trump administration. I mean, I think you would have to say that although clearly the chemistry between a British Prime Minister and an American president is important, it's not the biggest factor in the relationship between the two countries. The biggest factor is our defense relationship and our security and intelligence relationship. And in some ways, that is the most worrying aspect of the Trump presidency, or at least the potential presidency, and the mood music that has come out of some of the people who are going to be working for President Trump. In the sense that Britain is obviously very committed to its membership of NATO, feels very strongly about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and would be very, very worried, I think, were Trump to pull back on his NATO commitments, or at least cast doubt on the NATO commitment. And of course, would not like Trump to solve the Ukraine problem by giving Russia exactly what it wants, because that would, as far as most British people are concerned and many other Europeans are concerned, that would represent appeasement of Vladimir Putin. So I think one of the worrying things for Labour is that irrespective of the personal relationship that Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, might have with Donald Trump, the security and intelligence and military relationship could run into trouble. That isn't the only aspect of the relationship between the US and the UK. There's an awful lot of foreign investment in the UK from the United States of America, and there's actually quite a lot of services trade anyway, going the other way. And certainly there are concerns on the part of the government in the UK about Trump's potential implementation of tariffs, which may, of course, affect the UK as it would affect other countries. It's difficult to know quite how we would handle that, in the sense that because of Brexit, we're now no longer in the European Union, so we don't have the, as it were, shelter of the EU. And we are also hoping to increase our trade with China, which of course will not be very popular with President Trump. So the Trump presidency certainly does present a problem for the British government. I don't think, however, it presents that much more of a problem for a Labour government than it would for a Conservative government, to be honest, because, as I say, the main burden of that relationship is defence and security and intelligence on the one hand, and financial services on the other. And the Conservatives, were they in government, would be just as worried.
Professor Bale, the Middle East, Israel, war between Israel and Hamas, Palestinians, is it a major topic of interest for UK citizens? Even, I mean, in the sense, can it affect the elections? I mean, can it affect the popularity of Labour or Conservative?
Well, it is a big subject for debate, and has been ever since October the 7th. The opinions on it in the UK are quite polarised. There are, some people who feel very strongly about Israel's right to defend itself, and there are others who feel that that has been taken too far, and are calling what Israel is doing in Gaza as a crime against humanity, even according to some people, genocide. So there are very strong opinions on both sides there. And there is an extent to which those opinions are related to people's ethnic heritage. So obviously the Jewish community in Britain, which isn't particularly large, but is an important community in the UK, does tend to identify with Israel. Although it is very I think marked that many people in the Jewish community don't go as far as to give Israel their unqualified support, and that's certainly the case. And then, of course, there is a much bigger community of people from countries with a Muslim population. So people from South Asia, in particular Pakistan, in particular Bangladesh, for example, who feel very strongly that Israel's actions in Gaza are wrong morally, and the government in the UK should be doing more to protest them. And in terms of the electoral consequences, well, there certainly were some electoral consequences in 2024. Labour generally has been able to rely on stronger support from Britain's ethnic minorities, and in particular, actually, the South Asian population, which many of whom are Muslim. And in the 2024 election, Labour actually suffered some defeats in some normally quite safe seats to independent candidates who marketed themselves as pro-Gaza, not necessarily anti-Israel, but certainly pro-Gaza. Okay, it was only a handful of seats that Labour lost, but still, it was a serious problem. And it is also true to say, actually, Labour did lose a couple of seats to the Greens as well. And the Green Party, which is ostensibly an environmentalist party, but it was also a very left-wing party, also made quite a big deal of what was going on in Gaza. So I think the Labour government does have to worry a little bit in electoral terms. It can't be seen, I think, to be siding with Israel. And there was clearly some criticism from people who support Israel of the government's decision to limit some defence exports to Israel on legal grounds. So the government has to tread, I think, a rather narrow and quite difficult path on Israel Gaza. On the one hand, I think it is absolutely determined because it sees Israel as very much a kind of ally of the West, if you like, in the Middle East, to be seen to be supporting Israel's right to self-defense. But on the other hand, it cannot allow that support to be completely unqualified because there are many people in the Labour Party who would criticise Israel's actions, and there are of course people who perhaps previously supported the Labour Party and whose support Labour would like to get back, who are also very critical of Israel. So it is a difficult one. It's true to say that the Conservative Party, generally speaking, is much more inclined to be, if you like, pro-Israel than the Labour Party. But I wouldn't, if you like, make too strong a distinction between the Conservative government as was and the Labour government as is, because it's still the case that as far as the UK government, irrespective of who is actually controlling that government, generally speaking, is pretty supportive of Israel, but worried about some of Israel's actions.
Going back to Kemi Badenoch. So Kemi is actually typical new immigrant, who came to United Kingdom and joined the Conservative Party. So naturally, we would think that new immigrants should support Labour. Maybe it's kind of new tendency which will develop in the future, where actually immigrants will not try to, to establish the old homeland in the new homeland, but to join, to keep United Kingdom as United Kingdom and even make it stronger. Because, they all actually came for the United Kingdom because the life on their previous homeland was actually bad. So why to make the same in the United Kingdom?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting point. And you do see actually over the course of time that ethnic minority groups, especially if they're able to establish themselves economically, begin to move away from the Labour Party and towards the Conservative Party. Indeed, we first saw this with the Jewish community in the UK, which used to be incredibly strongly pro-Labour in the early part of the 20th century and into the middle of the 20th century. And then as they've been able to establish themselves economically, have tended to move more towards the Conservative Party. We've also seen this among some groups from the South Asian diaspora. So particularly, for example, Hindus from India, who used to vote Labour are now beginning to vote in greater numbers for the Conservatives. And again, the reason for that seems to be that they've established themselves economically, especially relative to their Muslim cousins who come from Pakistan, who come from Bangladesh, etc., etc. And that may well be true actually in the future. And it's beginning to, we're beginning to get hints of that from Black Africans who tend to have voted Labour in the past, but may be beginning to move towards the Conservatives, partly again because they're establishing themselves economically, in contrast to what we would refer to in the country as Afro-Caribbeans, in other words, people who come from the West Indies, who still tend to vote in much bigger numbers for the Labour Party, in part because economically they don't seem to have progressed or advanced so far. So Kemi Badenoch would not be unusual, and I think increasingly this will be the case in coming from an African background rather than an Afro-Caribbean background and moving into the Conservative Party. Having said that, I mean, the Conservative Party does have, obviously with Rishi Sunak, the previous Prime Minister, a record of promoting ethnic minority candidates into leadership positions, into cabinet positions, if not, prime ministerial positions. So, it would be untrue, I think, to think that Kemi Badenoch is, a complete departure or a complete breath of fresh air. But there is a caveat, and I think it is very important to understand that caveat, which is that although the Conservative Party at the very top level looks very diverse, actually, as you go down the levels of the Conservative Party, so once you move from the cabinet or the shadow cabinet when they're in opposition to the parliamentary party, once you go down to their councillors and local authorities, once you go down to their grassroots members, you find fewer and fewer ethnic minorities, fewer and fewer people of colour, as we sometimes refer to people from ethnic minority backgrounds. So I think the Conservative Party has, I think, very cleverly in some ways, created a bit of an illusion about its diversity. Actually, its membership, its councillors, its candidates tend to be white British, far more so than is the case, for example, for the Labour Party. And yet, actually, when it comes to the very top level, it's been very good at promoting those people into leadership positions. And I think there is an extent to which the Conservative Party has an innate appeal to some immigrant groups, in the sense that if they have, if you like, the British equivalent of the American dream, which is coming to the country with perhaps less than people who are already resident in the country, and then rising economically through their own hard work, then in some senses that dovetails very well with the Conservative emphasis on individual effort and indeed capitalism.
I have a question about the Conservative Party, about the Tory. What is the current agenda of the Conservative Party? Because in the past years, they had very confused messages. I was not sure what they stand for. Like, basic question, Brexit was good or bad? It was not clear. And if it's not clear from the messages, political messages wise, why people would vote if you are not confident about yourself? What is the current agenda?
Well, the current agenda, I think, is, as I said previously, Thatcherite, in the sense that I think the Conservative Party wants to reduce the size of the state on the grounds that if you do that, you create more room for the private sector, more room for economic growth, more incentives, if you like, for people with aspirations to move onwards and upwards to make money. And that money will hopefully help provide some of the public services that people rely on. So in the economic sphere, I don't think there's very much doubt about where the Conservatives stand. I think in the cultural sphere, they are rather more confused. There are some Conservatives, Kemi Badenoch among them, who feel very strongly about so-called cultural issues, and in particular these woke issues that I've talked about. Many other Conservatives see those as fairly irrelevant and regard themselves as socially pretty liberal. I think most Conservatives now, though, when it comes to immigration, are in favour of restriction, at least when it comes to people they identify as illegal immigrants, or most people would refer to them as undocumented or irregular migrants. They are very concerned to defend Britain's borders against illegal migration, and that is in most cases people coming across from France in small boats, because there is a very small stretch of water between France and the UK, and many more people, tens of thousands, are making that journey without papers, without the right to come here. And that is something that the Conservative Party is very concerned about, and some would say almost obsessed by, actually. But their concern with immigration goes further than illegality. They are also very concerned that, generally speaking, we import too much labour into this country, and that we should be doing more, if you like, to educate and upskill our population to do some of the jobs that currently are supplied by migrants. So the economic agenda is pretty clear. The agenda on migration is pretty clear. The agenda on woke is perhaps a little bit more confused and a little bit more contested. I think when it comes to geopolitics, foreign policy, I think the Conservative Party is not actually that far away from the Labour Party, in the sense that we're, very, very strongly committed to NATO, committed to our obligations to spend a certain percentage of our GDP on defence and on raising, in fact, that contribution. I think we want to maintain what we perhaps delusionally call our special relationship with the United States of America. I smile there because I don't think our relationship with the United States of America is any more special than other countries' relationship with the United States of America, Israel being the obvious example. But also, Germany would say the same, France might say the same as well. I think we are also committed, when we're talking about the Conservative Party, to maintaining Britain's global influence. So I think it's very important, for example, that we, hold on to our seat in a permanent seat in the Security Council of the United Nations. I think Britain still feels it has a role to play, whether it's in terms of its diplomatic reach or in terms just of its soft power in the rest of the world, where we're talking about Africa, Asia, South America. So, I think the Conservative agenda is pretty clear. I think the question for the Conservative Party and Kemi Badenoch will be whether the British public share that economic agenda. And I think that's where they have got a problem, in the sense that in governing between 2010 and 2024, the Conservatives really under-resourced public services, in particular the health service, and to some extent education and local services as well, which meant that a lot of those services are, creaking. Given we have a national health service in this country, we have seen waiting lists get very long for people to see consultants in hospitals and to have procedures. There are long waits now in the emergency room. It even is quite difficult to see your family doctor because there are so many people wanting to make appointments. And I think a party that continually suggests that somehow it can, cut the size of the state and continually talks about tax cuts, probably is misjudging the public mood now, in the sense that I think the public mood has moved away from tax cuts towards the need to actually spend some public money on revivifying those public services. So I think Kemi Badenoch and the Conservative Party have to be very careful when pursuing this kind of small state, low tax, low spend agenda, that they don't place themselves, if you like, to the, what you might call the kind of neoliberal right, if you like, of where most voters are at the moment. Because if you look at surveys of the British electorate, something I'm obviously very interested in, you will see that they are slightly to the right of centre when it comes to matters like immigration, for example. Most British people want lower immigration, they're quite restrictive, but actually a little bit to the left when it comes to the economy and public services. And I think, the Conservative Party has to make sure that it doesn't move too far from the British electorate. And I'm afraid over the course of 2010 to 2024, that's exactly what happened. And that's in part, anyway, why they lost the election. I should just make one other comment. You mentioned Brexit. And what's really interesting about the Conservative Party is that they seem completely unwilling to talk about Brexit now. It clearly hasn't been the success that they wanted it to be. We haven't done great free trade deals with the United States of America, with India, or with China. We have taken a very big hit to our economy year on year. Our exports seem to be down with our biggest market. There's a lot of friction in trade terms between the EU and the UK. So all the promises that were made by the Conservatives about Brexit just do not seem to have been realized. And there is now very strong evidence from opinion polling that, the plurality and sometimes even a majority of people think that Brexit was a mistake, even some people who voted for it. So it's not something really that the Conservative Party wants to talk about. But having said that, it's not something that the Labour Party and the Labour government want to talk about either, because the Labour government is too afraid of being accused of wanting to go back into the European Union. And therefore, there's if you like, a kind of cross-party vow of silence on Brexit, even though most people now think it was a bad idea, and there are, some polls which suggest a majority of people would like to rejoin.
Today, together with me on the podcast, Dr. Daniel Stajecki from Cambridge. So, Dr. Stajecki, maybe you have question for Professor Bale.
Thank you. Not so much of a question, but a commentary on the basis of what you said. If you look at the latest polls of the Jewish electorate in Britain, and that's probably the most interesting finding for us, and somewhat unexpected, given where the Conservatives and the Labour stand on the issues, on everything related to the conflict in the Middle East, you would probably expect, it would be reasonable to expect that the Jewish electorate sides with the Conservative Party, there's a majority with the Conservative, there's the plurality at the very least. What we don't see there is exactly that. In this particular election in 2024, the majority of Jews sided with the Labour Party. There is internal politics. So Jewish community is very far from homogeneous. And if you cut it across into more or less religious groups, the more religious groups actually side with the conservatives. The less religious groups, which are by now a majority and will be for a while, are with the Labour. So that's now the second point of interest is that on the whole, Jewish community this time voted almost exactly like the Indians. I could have smuggled you one data set as representing a different community. You wouldn't have suspected a fraud if I wanted to. That's just how it was.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to what we were talking about before, which is that actually those two communities have moved on economically from when they first came to this country, and obviously for the Jewish community that was much earlier than the Indian diaspora, but both of them have done incredibly well in the UK. And have therefore, left behind perhaps some of their Labour voting instincts. But that's not to say, and I think it's important actually that you made that point, that's not to say that necessarily a majority of them will be voting Conservative. It's just to say that you have seen over time a movement away from Labour towards the Conservatives. The polling of the Jewish community is really, really interesting because, for example, on Gaza, it is very obvious that a majority actually, and certainly a plurality of Jewish people surveyed have very big reservations about what Israel is doing in Gaza and are particularly unenamored, if we can put it that way, Benjamin Netanyahu and some of the more right-wing members of his administration. So there is a degree to which Jewish people in the UK take a fairly, if you like, progressive or certainly liberal and in some ways more sort of pacific or pacifistic line to the Middle East conflict, and certainly would like to see it resolved as soon as possible, and are very worried about the humanitarian consequences of the war in Gaza and indeed the war being extended in Lebanon as well. So I think you're right. It's absolutely true to say that no community is homogenous, and clearly there are quite big differences. I think it's also important to point out, if we're going into the kind of contemporary history, Labour lost an awful lot of support among Jewish people when Jeremy Corbyn, their very left-wing, very radical leader, took over the party in 2015. And there were accusations, I think well-founded accusations actually, of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party at that point. And the Labour Party had to work very, very hard under Keir Starmer to root out that anti-Semitism and to try and build bridges with the Jewish community. And to be honest, actually, I think Keir Starmer has managed to do that quite effectively. Whether Labour's slightly equivocal stance, as some would see it, on Israel Gaza will alienate some Jewish people, I would expect it will. But actually, I'm not sure that it's out of kilter, out of tune with the plurality or the majority of Jewish people who, as I say, do have concerns about what Israel is doing in Gaza.
I think one thing that we certainly noticed in the Jewish and ethnic data sets, the voting data sets, if there is one vibe, if there's one thing that I can say about it, just having looked at the data, is that it's very, very difficult to discern in 2024, I'm not saying before, but in 2024, clear ethnic or racial or religious interest leading the voting patterns. You really come across unexpected things. So Jewish support, plurality, let's say, Jewish plurality for Labour on this occasion could be interpreted as surprising. Equally, interestingly, across all ethnic groups, Jews, Muslims, Indians, and Blacks, so it's a racial group, we could see some levels, non-negligible levels of support, for example, for Reform UK. That doesn't match the 15% or so that is observed in the general in public in general, but there are some levels of support for that political force as well. So really, approaching any of these groups with minding some sort of imaginary, let's say, ethnic or religious interest doesn't particularly pay. So these groups seems like react to general politics and follow, split into streams. That's the rule of the game more than any kind of
I think that's really important, and in some ways that is a tribute to the extent to which Britain does manage to integrate minorities rather more successfully perhaps than some other European countries, in the sense that as you point out, very many ethnic groups don't vote that differently from their quote unquote white British counterparts, and they vote for the same reasons. Jewish people need to use the National Health Service. Jewish people worry about the state of schools. Not all Jewish people are sending their kids to Jewish schools, or even if they do, some of those schools are state schools, for example. Jewish people will worry about migration and immigration in the same way as some Indians and some people from Pakistani or Bangladeshi backgrounds are not necessarily pro-immigration. And of course, support for Reform, which is this radical right-wing populist party, will extend into minority communities, partly because of their concerns about immigration, partly because some people in those communities are fed up with the two main parties, feel that both of them have failed, and want to try something different, and are obviously attracted by a charismatic politician like Nigel Farage, who leads the Reform Party. So, I think you make a really good point there. It's easy to carve up the electorate into particular groups, but in the end, and I think, as I say, it is a bit of a tribute to Britain's success in integrating people, that we share common concerns in this country.
Okay, Professor Tim Bale, thank you very much for being with us. It was a pleasure. And
thank you. It was a really enjoyable conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.